you know, I don't know how you lay it out properly, but you tell people that you love how to avoid the road to hell. And you don't do that because you're shaking your finger at them or because you're a moral authority. You do it because you don't want them to burn. There's this old idea in the Old Testament that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and I kind of understand what that means. Because one of the things, say, we do with the Future Authoring Program, we offer people a little heaven. It's like, okay, construct your ideal, aim at it, come up with a plan. You're going to modify the plan, no problem. You're going to do a bad job of it, no problem, just do it. Okay, so then now you've got a goal. It's now your approach systems, technically speaking, the positive emotion systems that motivate you are engaged because they're engaged in relationship to a goal. And the more transcendent the goal, the more they're engaged. But that's not good enough. It's great to run towards something you like, but it's even better to run away from something that terrifies you. So then we ask people, okay, so here, think about this real carefully. Take all your faults and your inadequacies and your hatred for life, all of that. And then imagine that gets the upper hand. And then think about where you could be in 3 to 5 years. And everyone knows, hey, some people know they'd be a street person, some people know they'd be an alcoholic, some people know they'd be a prostitute or a drug addict. Like, everybody's got their own little hell they could descend into with fair degree of rapidity and a fair bit of enjoyment. And people know that. And so I say, well, delineate that out too. So you know where you're headed when you fall off the path. And so then you're running away and running towards, it's like, yes, well, that's heaven and hell. And you need it, and they're real. They're as real as anything that you can. It depends on what you mean by real, I suppose, but they're as real as you make them. How about that? And people can make hell pretty real. So there's an idea that Christ is a messianic figure because he took the suffering of the world onto himself. And what that means to me is that he was someone, speaking conceptually, who decided that the suffering of the world was his responsibility, and that that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to decide that that's your responsibility. You take that on as a burden. You do the same with the malevolence. So when you read history, you read history as a perpetrator, right? Maybe you also read it as a victim, but you certainly read it as a perpetrator. And then that's on you. Okay, so then the question is, what happens when you do that? And I would say the answer is two things, is that, first of all, it starts to force you to develop, like to learn what you need to learn in the world and to absorb the information that would enable you to start to face the suffering and to rectify it. So that forces you to become a more competent person, and that's the socialization part that you thought of as so important. But then there's a secondary thing that happens too, which is that taking on that additional stress and demand voluntarily transforms you biologically, because within your genetic structure, let's say, there's all sorts of potential, but that won't be unlocked unless you place yourself in a position where the demands necessitate it. And so by following that pathway, truth, let's say, the acceptance of suffering and the confrontation with malevolence, so that's the heaviest load that you could take on, then you actually produce a psychophysiological / spiritual transformation in yourself that matures you into like the representation of the Father on earth. And one of the things I tried to think through is why you should tell the truth. So it's not self-evident, man. A smart kid, the smarter the kid, the earlier they learn to lie. Lying is very powerful because you can manipulate the world with your language. And then you can get what you want lots of times, or escape from things that you don't want. So why not lie all the time? Well, I think the reason is, there's a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that you can't trust yourself if you lie. And there's going to be times in your life where you have no one to turn to except you. And so if you've stuffed yourself full of lies, then you're going to be in a crisis one day and you're going to have to make a decision, and you're going to decide wrong, and you're going to be in real trouble because you won't have the clarity of mind necessary to make the proper judgment, because you've filled your imagination and your perception with rubbish. So I just walked through the Museum of the Bible in Washington. It was a cool thing to walk through because it's chronological. They have one floor which is the history of the Bible. Now, in many ways, the first book was the Bible. At one point, there was only one book, like as far as our Western culture is concerned, there was one book. And for a while, literally, there was only one book. And that book was the Bible. And then before it was the Bible, it was it was scrolls and it was writings on papyrus. But we were starting to aggregate written text together. And it went through all sorts of technological transformations, and then it became books that everybody could buy, the book everybody could buy, and the first one of those was the Bible. And then it became all sorts of books that everybody could buy. But all those books, in some sense, emerged out of that underlying book. What I figured out was the meaning we derive from the verbal domain is encoded in the relationship between words. So now then you think, well, let's think about the relationship between words. Well, some words are dependent on other words. Some ideas are dependent on other ideas. The more ideas are dependent on a given idea, the more fundamental that idea is. That's a definition of fundamental. So now imagine you have an aggregation of texts in a civilization. You say, which are the fundamental texts? And the answer is, the texts upon which most other texts depend. And so you'd put Shakespeare way in there in English, because so many texts are dependent on Shakespeare's literary revelations. And Milton would be in that category, and Dante would be in that category, at least in translation. Fundamental authors, part of the Western canon, because those texts influenced more other texts. And then you think about that as a hierarchy, with the Bible at its base, which is certainly the case. Now imagine that's the entire corpus of linguistic production, all things considered. Now, how do you understand that? Like, literally, how do you understand that? The answer is, you sample it by reading and listening to stories and listening to people talk. You sample that whole domain. You build a low-resolution representation of that inside you, and then you listen and see through that. And so it isn't that the Bible is true. It's that the Bible is the precondition for the manifestation of truth, which makes it way more true than just true. It's a whole different kind of true. And I think this is not only literally the case, factually, I think it can't be any other way. It's the only way we can solve the problem of perception. As if you talk to people, they say, well, I want to have a meaningful life. Generally, people want that. But then you think, well, then why aren't you? And then you think, well, what does it mean to have a meaningful life exactly? And then you think, well, maybe it means that you have to take on responsibility, because your sacrifices have to be worth something, right? It has to have some meat, what you're aiming at. It has to be something that can elevate your worm-like self to the level of tolerability. You know, you can say, well, yeah, I've got all these flaws, but look at what I'm trying to do. Right. That's the real ground of self-respect. To the degree that you're privileged to see that, that calls you to be a better person. And you can think of that, you know, biologically. Well, you have these fragile creatures that you're responsible for. Of course, that's going to call you to a higher mode of action, because otherwise they're not going to live, you know. So it's very practical. But what you see there is if you view someone with love, then it's incumbent upon you to treat them as if they're valuable. And then the more you treat other people as if they're valuable, the better person you are. That just comes along for the ride in some sense. So none of that seems questionable to me. That seems solid. And so then maybe the more love you view other people with, the higher the moral demand that's placed on you. And then I would say too, well then, that's another reason why it's so important to be truthful and in some sense to be good, because it isn't obvious to me that you can withstand that moral load if you're compromised by too much sin. It's too much. And that's another thing that we're not very good at teaching young people about. You know, you shouldn't do that. You know, it's like there's a sanctimonious authority that goes along with that that's the wrong tone. It's more like, you know, I don't know how you lay it out properly, but you tell people that you love how to avoid the road to hell. And you don't do that because you're shaking your finger at them or because you're a moral authority. You do it because you don't want them to burn.